Welcome to the kingdom. I'm Chris, and this is Good Enough Gaming. Welcome everybody. Today I'm going to be painting the Curseling, not to be confused with the Changeling. As with the other Tzeentch models I've been painting so far, I'm priming them in a gray because it works a little bit better, I think. And we're starting off with Thousand Suns Blue as the base coat. That's what I paint my Thousand Suns in. They're Tzeentch Marines, and I think I like that color a little better than the Sotek green that the GW app recommends, and that's what's on the box art. So this guy's going to be looking very Thousand Suns-y when we're done with him. You definitely are going to have to do 2 coats with this, even though it's a pretty decent base paint. It does show through a little bit, so just get used to the fact you'll have to do 2 coats of it. While you're waiting for that first coat to dry, a great idea is to get your lead belcher or other metallic. You could start off with a brighter one, given what we're going to do to it in a second here, but paint the chainmail tabard that's hanging in front of him, and then in all of the joints, in the elbows, behind the knees, all of that. There's lots and lots of that metal, so give it a covering. And then you can paint the second coat of the blue on. For the sword, we're going to start with a base coat of corn red, and as you'll see, I'll mention how we're going to give it that darker look as it gradually gets closer and closer to the tip. But fairly quick, give it a nice quick coat of red, let it dry, you'll have to put a second one on there. Okay, now here we're going to lighten up that metal. So like I said, if you have a brighter base metal you want to start with, go with that. Otherwise, you could use Ironbreaker, Runefang Steel, anything like that, but you want this to be a fairly bright silver because we're going to put a wash on it to give it a little bit of color. While we're waiting for that to dry now, we'll go back to the armor, and you could use Drakenhof Nightshade, or you could use Nuln Oil. Just depends if you want a darker or a more blue tinted shade, but I'm going to use the black shade here. Fairly thin, you don't want to gob it on, you just want to slightly darken the color of the metal so when you come back and paint the next layer on top of it, it has a little bit of shadow separating it from the trim around the armor. So pretty quick job. And give it a good wash. Now while we're waiting for that blue to dry, because wash takes some time, get some Rhinox hide or another dark brown, and we'll start painting that one big horn sticking out of his head. For now you can just cover the entire thing. We're eventually going to layer over it with some lighter khaki, tan, and bone color to lighten it up, but for now you can just put the base on. Alright, returning to the armor. Ahriman Blue is the highlight that they produce specifically to go with Thousand Suns armor, and I think it looks really good. It's a nice, not quite teal, but there is a little hint of green to it. So I'm going to go around to each of the panels, paint it in. Don't go right to the edges though. Let that wash serve as the kind of the bridge between the blue from the Ahriman and then the edge of the armor plating. And just like with the first coat, the first blue, you're going to have to do 2 coats of each. It's a layer paint, so it's very, very thin. And for your second coat, it'll go on a lot quicker, and it'll look really good when it's done. You'll see. Alright, continuing our little game of ping pong, going from waiting for something to dry to painting the next thing to wait to dry. Get yourself Druchii Violet or another purple shade. I find the Vallejo shades are very dark, so if you want a lot of color, use one of those. If you just want a slight tint or hint or tinge, whichever one of those words suits you best, the Citadel washes I think are a little better for that. Okay, now for the blade. What I'm doing here, I'm just going to do it once, but you'll go back and do this probably about 4 to 5 times, is wash the blade, but each time start a little further closer to the tip. So you'll notice here I'm not putting the wash on the bottom like quarter of it, and we'll keep going back and do that each time the wash on the blade dries. Now we're going back and we can finish off the armor with the highlight of that blue there. You can use Temple Guard blue, you can use Lothern blue, just a light blue. Paint that on the sharpest edges of the armor, and also a little bit on the top part of the armor plating where the light's definitely going to hit it. That'll help give you that illusion that it's actually curving and rounded at the leg pieces there. Make sure you get all the edges, and when you're done, it'll give that armor that nice pop to it. Okay, so there's how he looks when he's done. You can see putting that highlight in a few judicious places just gives him a little more depth to it. Now's my favorite part. I love the way that the gold and blue looks on Tzeentch and Thousand Suns type characters, but it is such a pain in the butt to paint because you have no alternative but to go very slow around the whole edge. It's the only way you're going to do it. With Thousand Suns, it's even worse. They're half blue and half gold. There is no shortcut. You have to detail pretty much everything. So find yourself a good movie, good book. Make sure the paint is flowing nicely. Take your time, because if you make a mistake, you're going to have to redo the panel, and that will be irritating given how many layers of paint you already got on it. But take your time, and when you're done, it'll look like that. I think it's worth it. It's a pain in the butt while you're doing it, but when you're finished, I think it looks fantastic. Okay, so let's get to some of the other elements of this. The little critter that's growing out of him and is kind of directing him. I love the fact that he has his hand on top of his head there. We'll start with a base coat of Rathkar flesh. We will end up darkening that down, but make sure that you get that little arm that's sticking out in the front. I almost missed that the first time I painted him. You'll need 2 coats just like everything else. While we're waiting for that flesh to dry, I'll color in the bird skulls and that little rope, both the one around his waist and there's another one here up by his chest. Small little details, but those will end up getting 3 or 4 coats of paint on them. While we're waiting for everything to dry, we'll touch up that little bit of leather holding on that second bird skull. So we'll just use the Rhinox hide from when we painted his horn. And speaking of his horn, let's go back and start highlighting it. So with Xandri Dust, we're going to paint probably a little more than half of it solid. Just paint right over top of that, the darker brown with the Xandri Dust. But then to blend it in, we're going to use the edge of the brush and just paint along the raised parts to kind of pull the Xandri Dust down into that darker brown and make it look more like this natural horn that's getting lighter as it gets closer to the top. So use the edge of your brush for that part. Alright, now we're going to shade the actual demon that's attached to this guy. You could use whatever shade you want. You could use a flesh shade. You could use sepia. I chose Agrax because this guy's supposed to be like literally the devil on his shoulder. So I didn't want to use the flesh shade or the sepia because that gives it a warmer tinge to it. Whereas I wanted this guy to look dark, shadowy, really a negative kind of aura to him. So we're going to use the earth shade there. As far as the feathers that are spilling out from behind, these are going to be kind of a tricky purplish gray look. So we're going to start with Skavenblight Dinge. You could use Eshin Gray, but again, I want this guy to have a little bit of a dirty appearance to him. So the Skavenblight Dinge has a slightly dirtier brownish gray look to it. So we'll get the feathers both on the back and the front, and we'll get that bit over his shoulders, but not the ones on top of his head. Alright, by this point, we're ready to put the last little highlight on the horn. So a little over half of the Xandri Dust now, you're going to paint over with Ushabti Bone or Screaming Skull or just some other really light color like that. And just like we did before, once you've painted the solid block area, use the edge of your brush to paint raised edges and the ridges to pull that color down into the other two. You'll see what I mean when I start getting that ridge part here. But that helps to blend all the 3 colors together and actually look like the horn is transitioning in color naturally rather than just being painted in 3 different colors. Alright, at this point the shade on the flesh of the demon should be dry, so now we can go back with our darker gray, the same kind of Skavenblight Dinge that we had on the feathers, and we can now put it on pretty much the entirety of that hand holding the staff, and on the knuckles and the back of the hand on his right hand, which is on top of the knight's head there. Because eventually all this is going to get that purple wash and get it looking a little more Tzeentch-y. We'll also paint the beaks of these black. I did that just because that's what the box art has. You're perfectly fine if you just leave them as bird skulls that are all one piece. It's just a matter of preference, but I was painting this for someone and they said make it like the box, so that's what I'm doing. Okay, now let's start giving those feathers that purplish tinge we're going to work with. So Druchii Violet over top. You could do 2 coats if you want it to be a really deep purple, but I just wanted to have a slight purple look to it. So if the gray was too dark, you wouldn't see it. If it was too light, it wouldn't fit. So that's why I said Eshin or Skaven Blight Dinge are your best bets here, because they'll hold the purple color without getting too bright. Now what I haven't shown while I've been painting this is every time I notice the blade is totally dry, I've been going back and putting another very thin layer of wash over top, and you can see by now there is a nice soft gradual transition from the bright red or the deep red at the bottom to the dark black at the top. We're not quite ready to finish the blade yet though, so let's go back and finish off this demon here. Using the same corn red because I want the feathers coming out of the top of his body to match the sword, to give it that kind of balance to it. So again, we'll do a nice strong base coat, and now we can start looking at the sword while we're waiting for those feathers to dry. So using Wild Rider red, we're gonna just do the highlight edges, just the very tip. There's a curve around the sword, and then it also branches off into that 8-pointed star, or at least part of one that Chaos is so famous for. And we'll paint the ridge of the sword that's going in the middle about halfway up, just to when it's really definitely black and no longer much red. Flip the sword over, do the same thing on the other side. Get the raised edges, get the star points as they're sticking out, and then paint the ridge of the blade about halfway up. For the remainder of the blade, you could either go back to the corn red and just kind of restore it to its original color. You could use a brighter red like Mephiston red. I wouldn't go too much more than that though, because you want it to look like it's darkening as it gets to the tip. So one of those two, just lightly with the edge of your brush, drag it along that raised portion of the blade. And at that point, we're just about finished with the blade. Get a little bit on the edges of the front there, the cutting edge, and then here on these little these ridges at the back. And then our final highlight on the sword, using Troll Slayer orange on that half chaos star on the bottom, and then we'll again follow the ridge of the sword up, not the whole way, probably about half of it. So we get the blend from the bright orange to the darker orange to the dark red, and that's that. All right, let's darken down these feathers here just like we did with the sword, but we're only going to do 1 coat here. Rather than trying to darken the tips, we'll just brighten them instead. You'll see what I mean when we get to it. 1 coat of Nuln Oil, that's about it. While I'm waiting for that to dry, I'll come back to the skulls, touch them up with some Ushabti bone just to give them a little more of a pop, otherwise they'll blend in too much with the rest of the armor. Now after doing those, the feathers weren't dry yet, so we'll turn now to that staff. There's nothing else that we're going to need to paint that's touching the staff, so very carefully with Lead Belcher, you'll get the bulk of the staff, the main area underneath. The foot of the staff and the head of the staff are going to be gold, but everything else will start off with this nice silver base coat. And now we can turn to doing the gold. This one can go pretty quickly because we're going to rely on a shade to do most of the detail on this part here. But make sure you get the back, make sure you get the front, and make sure you don't accidentally touch the brush on anything else, otherwise you got to start over. The handle, we're just going to do a simple black. I didn't want to mess around with trying to give it color. There's enough color on this guy. The feathers on the head still weren't totally wet, especially at the base, so we'll do a couple more touch-ups and highlights at other places while we're waiting. First, a tiny little strip of gray on top of the beaks, and then we'll switch to Dawnstone and we're going to start highlighting the feathers on the cape, cloak, or whatever the heck that is that's coming out of the back of this guy here. So for this, just get the raised edges or the tip of the feather. You want the majority of that purple to still be showing through underneath. This is just to give the illusion that these feathers are kind of flowing or fluffing out in the wind or the breeze or what have you. So get the cloak, get the collar of feathers you have around here, and we'll also use it to highlight the very edges on top of his hands, both where he's holding the staff and where he's holding the knight's head. Okay, those feathers are finally dry, so we're going to do a very light highlight of corn red back on the top to give them a little bit of color there, and then when that's dry, We'll use the same color scheme we did on the blade. So Wild Rider Red to get about half of the area that you painted with the Corn Red. We'll now do Wild Rider over top. And once we've got that, we'll then switch to Fire Dragon Bright, just to get the very, very tips of the feathers to, as always, make them stick out, make them pop. For the gold on the staff, we'll use my go-to shade for gold, Reikland Flesh Shade. You can use it fairly generously, because even if it dries in some of those gobs, it will actually provide that real nice aesthetic, the dark in the shade areas. Let the shade do the work for you there. Now, once it's dry, we'll go back with Averland Sunset, and we'll paint the eyes. There are, I think, 4 of them, if I'm not mistaken here. So there's the front of his chest, there's the top shoulder, there's either side of the staff, and I believe there's one more on his right shoulder. So you go over it once with the yellow, and then we're going to give it a tiny wash to bring out the recessed areas. And then if you wish, you can go back with a slightly brighter yellow, like Uriel yellow, and give another little highlight on either side. And there it is. Curseling's all finished. The gold was a bit of a pain, but now that it's done, I think it looks good enough.